The frozen air cut like a blade across the Montana highlands as Thomas Bennett urged Copper through the deepening drifts of Willow Creek. The temperature had plummeted to 15 below, and the wind carried ice crystals that stung any exposed skin. Tom pulled his scarf higher, squinting against the white chaos that swallowed the landscape. He'd been checking the northern fence line when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost convinced himself it was the wind playing tricks through the willows. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But Kappa's ears swiveled forward with sudden alertness, nostrils flaring as the horse came to an abrupt halt. Tom had learned long ago to trust his horse's instincts more than his own. When Kappa refused to move forward, turning his head insistently toward the frozen creek bed, Tom felt the first stirring of unease in his chest. The sound came again, clearer now, a desperate whinnying that rose and fell like a prayer carried on the wind. Tom's heart kicked hard against his ribs as he guided Copper toward the sound, and what he discovered in that frozen creek would shatter everything he thought he knew about survival, about loss, and about the stubborn persistence of life itself. 3 foals lay tangled in the ice and frigid water where the creek had partially collapsed beneath them, their small bodies trembling violently, steam rising from their coats in ghostly plumes. The sight stopped Tom's breath in his lungs. This wasn't supposed to happen. Foals this young shouldn't be out here at all. Not in the dead of winter, not without their mothers, not fighting against ice that had locked around their legs like frozen shackles. What followed in the days ahead would test every ounce of strength Tom had left, would force him to open doors he'd sealed shut 3 years ago, and would prove that sometimes the very act of saving another life can save your own. But first, he had to get them out of that creek alive. The storm had arrived without warning, the way January storms often did in Blackridge Valley. One moment the sky held that pale winter brightness that made the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds, and the next, clouds rolled over the peaks with the speed of an avalanche, turning the world into a churning mass of white. Tom had finished his morning rounds early, checking the cattle in the southern pasture, making sure the water troughs hadn't frozen solid overnight. The cold had settled into his bones the way it always did these days. Not just the winter cold, but the deeper chill that came from living alone in a house that still echoed with absence. Copper moved beneath him with familiar steadiness, the red roan's breath creating clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter air. The horse had been Rachel's favorite, a gift Tom had given her on their 10th anniversary. She'd named him Copper for the autumn color of his coat, the shade of leaves just before they fell. After she died, Tom had considered selling him along with the other horses. Couldn't bear the reminders, couldn't stand walking into the barn and seeing the empty stalls where life used to gather and shuffle and whinny. But when he'd led Copper toward the trailer that would take him to the auction, the horse had planted his hooves and refused to budge, looking back at Tom with eyes that seemed to hold an accusation and a plea all at once. Tom had stood there in the January wind, similar to this one, and felt something crack inside him. He'd unsaddled Copper, turned him back into the pasture, and that was that. They stayed together, 2 creatures bound by the memory of someone they'd both loved. The fence line ran along the eastern edge of the property, where Willow Creek marked the boundary between Bennett land and the national forest beyond. Tom rarely came out this far in winter. The cattle stayed closer to the barn where he could feed them easily, and there was no reason to check fence posts buried under 3 feet of snow. But something had nagged at him that morning, an instinct he couldn't name, the kind of feeling that made old ranchers check one more time before settling in for the night. Rachel used to tease him about it, calling it his weather sense, his animal sense, his stubborn sense. She'd laugh and tell him he was part warrior, part mystic, and entirely incapable of sitting still when his gut told him otherwise. He'd been right to listen. The northern section of fence had come down, probably from the weight of ice accumulation on the wire. 3 posts leaned at dangerous angles, and the barbed wire sagged into the snow. Tom dismounted, his boots sinking deep, and began assessing the damage. It would need repairs, but not today. Today was for survival, for getting back before the storm worsened, for making sure everything that depended on him made it through another night. He was reaching for Kappa's reins when the sound reached him. At first, he thought it was the wind. The storm created strange acoustics in the valley, making familiar sounds alien and conjuring noises from nothing. But this was different. This had rhythm, desperation, the unmistakable quality of a living thing in distress. Copper heard it too, his whole body going rigid, ears pricked so far forward they nearly touched at the tips. The horse took several steps toward the creek without any guidance from Tom, moving with purpose through the heavy drifts. Tom followed, his heart beginning to hammer with apprehension. Wild horses sometimes came down from the high country in winter, searching for food and shelter when the mountain passes became impassable. But they were rare sightings, ghosts more than flesh, and they certainly didn't sound like that. This was young, this was terrified, this was running out of time. He pushed through the last stand of willows, their bare branches rattling like bones in the wind, and emerged at the creek bank. The scene that met his eyes sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system so powerful his hands began to shake. Willow Creek ran fast and cold even in the depths of winter, fed by springs that never quite froze. Ice formed along the edges and across the slower pools, but the current underneath remained treacherous. Someone unfamiliar with the creek might think the ice safe, might believe the white surface could hold weight. The foals had learned otherwise. 3 of them thrashed in the water where the ice had given way, their small bodies struggling against the current and the cold that was surely stealing their strength with every passing second. The youngest, a white foal with gray dappling across its haunches, had managed to get its front legs up onto the ice shelf, but the edge kept breaking under its weight, plunging it back into the frigid water. A dark bay foal, slightly larger, fought with wild panic, eyes rolling white, churning the water into foam as it tried and failed to find purchase. The third, a palomino with a flaxen mane already thick with ice, had gone eerily still, only its labored breathing and the occasional weak movement of its head indicating it still lived. Tom's mind raced through options even as his body moved forward. The ice wouldn't hold his weight, that much was immediately clear. The foals had broken through in a section where the current ran faster, where the ice never formed as thick. If he stepped out onto it, he'd join them in the water, and then they'd all die together. Copper came up beside him, pushing his muzzle against Tom's shoulder with enough force to make him stagger. The horse's eyes were fixed on the foals, ears swiveling between their cries and Tom, as if asking what they were going to do, as if expecting Tom to have an answer. Tom's thoughts flew to his saddlebag, mentally cataloging what he carried. Rope, always rope. A folding saw for clearing fallen branches from gates. Leatherwork gloves. A thermos of coffee that would be lukewarm by now. Wire cutters. Nothing that seemed adequate for the task in front of him, but it would have to be enough. He yanked the coiled rope free, his fingers already numb despite his gloves, and tried to assess the situation with the calculating eye of someone who'd spent 47 years dealing with the stubborn realities of ranch life. The white foal was closest, maybe 10 feet from the bank. The bay was farther out, 15 feet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At least, losing the battle against exhaustion and cold. The palomino had drifted slightly downstream, caught in an eddy where broken ice chunks circled like a slow-motion whirlpool. Tom knew enough about hypothermia to understand they didn't have much time. In water this cold, a full-grown horse might last 15 minutes before its core temperature dropped to dangerous levels. These foals, barely weaned by the look of them, probably had less. Their small bodies simply couldn't generate enough heat to fight the cold stealing it away. He tied one end of the rope to his saddle horn, testing the knot twice, then fashioned a loop in the other end. It wasn't a proper lasso, his fingers were too cold for that kind of precision, but it might work if he could get it over the white foal's head. The animal was still fighting, still had enough strength to struggle, which meant it still had enough strength to resist help. Tom had worked with horses his entire life, had gentled wild mustangs and broken stubborn colts, but he'd never tried to rescue a panicked foal from a frozen creek while a blizzard howled around him. He inched toward the edge, testing each step, feeling for the solid ground beneath the snow. The ice creaked ominously under even this indirect pressure. Copper backed up instinctively, taking up slack in the rope, planting his hooves in that way horses do when they're preparing to pull against resistance. Smart horse, Tom thought, not for the first time. Smarter than his owner probably deserved. He swung the loop out toward the white foal, missed, pulled it back. The wind kept catching the rope, pushing it off course. The foal saw the rope coming and shied away with what little energy it had left, making the task that much harder. Tom forced himself to breathe slowly, to ignore the way his heart hammered against his ribs, to shut out the desperate sounds coming from the creek. He'd done hard things before. He'd held Rachel's hand while the cancer ate her from the inside out, had watched her fade over months while feeling completely powerless to stop it. He'd scattered her ashes in the pasture where she'd loved to watch the horses run. He'd survived 3 years of silence in a house that still smelled like her lavender soap. He could do this. He had to do this. The loop sailed out again, and this time it dropped over the white foal's head. The animal immediately began to thrash harder, terrified by this new constraint, but Tom was already backing up, calling to Copper. The gelding understood instantly, leaning back into his haunches and pulling. The rope went taut, and for a horrible moment Tom thought it would simply tighten around the foal's neck and strangle it. But the angle was right, just barely, and instead of choking, the pressure began to drag the small horse toward the bank. The white foal found its footing on the creek bottom, scrabbling with its hind legs, and suddenly it was surging forward with a burst of desperate energy. Ice shattered around it as it lunged toward shore, and then it was on the bank, streaming water, shaking violently. Tom moved quickly to loosen the rope from around its neck before the animal could panic further and hurt itself. The foal collapsed almost immediately, sides heaving, steam rising from its coat in thick clouds. It was alive, but barely, and Tom knew he'd have to get it warm soon or hypothermia would finish what the creek had started. But there were still 2 more in the water, and his rope was already wet, already beginning to stiffen in the cold. The bay foal had stopped fighting, which somehow was worse than the thrashing. It floated in the current, only its nose above water, eyes glazed with exhaustion and shock. The palomino remained caught in the eddy, spinning slowly, making small movements that barely qualified as swimming. Tom pulled the rope free from the white foal and turned back toward the creek. His hands were shaking now, not just from cold but from the adrenaline flooding his system, the terrible knowledge that he might not be fast enough, might not be strong enough, might have to watch these animals die despite everything he tried. He made the loop again, larger this time, hoping to drop it over the bay's entire head and neck for a better hold. The wind had picked up, and snow now fell so thickly he could barely see the far bank of the creek. The world had narrowed to this single point, this frozen creek and these dying foals and the rope in his numb hands. He threw and the loop fell short. Threw again, and the wind carried it wide. The bay foal's head dipped under the water, came back up, dipped again. Time was running out. Copper snorted and stamped, agitated, sensing Tom's fear. The white foal behind them tried to stand, made it halfway up, and collapsed back into the snow. Tom threw the rope a 3rd time, putting every ounce of strength into the cast, and the loop settled over the bay foal's head. He pulled, Copper pulled, and the bay came toward them, limp now, barely conscious. It took both of them to drag the foal onto the bank, and when Tom knelt beside it, he wasn't sure it was still breathing. He put his ear to the small chest, feeling for the heartbeat he desperately needed to find. There, faint and irregular, but there. The bay's eyes were closed, its body frighteningly still. Tom stripped off his coat without thinking and threw it over the foal, then his flannel shirt, leaving himself in just his thermal undershirt against the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he ignored it. Copper stood close, blocking some of the wind, and Tom worked his hands over the foal's body, trying to generate warmth through friction, trying to will life back into the small creature. The palomino was still in the water, but it had drifted closer to shore, caught on a shelf of ice that had held under its reduced weight. It looked at Tom with eyes that held an expression he recognized, the same exhausted acceptance he'd seen in Rachel's eyes near the end, when she'd stopped fighting and started letting go. That look gutted him more than the cold or the fear or the impossible situation. He couldn't let it happen. He wouldn't. But he only had one rope, and it was already frozen stiff in places, already pushed beyond what it was designed for. The palomino was farther away than the others had been, in a more dangerous position where the current ran faster. If the loop slipped, if the ice broke, if Copper couldn't hold the weight, they could lose everything they'd already saved. Tom looked at the white foal shivering violently on the bank, at the bay lying motionless under his coat, and made his decision. He tied the rope to his saddle horn again, fashioned the loop with fingers that barely responded to his commands, and threw. The loop sailed through the falling snow and landed perfectly over the palomino's head on the first try. Tom didn't have time to feel relief or triumph. He pulled, and Copper backed up, but the palomino didn't move. The current had it pinned against the ice shelf, and the foal seemed to have given up entirely. Tom pulled harder, feeling the rope bite into his palms even through the gloves, feeling his muscles strain against the combined weight of water and exhausted animal. Copper grunted with effort, hooves sliding slightly in the snow before finding purchase. Still the palomino didn't come. Tom made a sound that was half curse, half prayer, and pulled again. Something shifted. The ice cracked with a sound like a gunshot, and suddenly the palomino was moving, sliding across the broken surface toward the bank. The current caught it and tried to drag it downstream, but Copper held firm, powerful haunches trembling with effort. The foal hit shallower water and its legs touched bottom. For a moment it just stood there, water rushing around its chest, head hanging so low its muzzle nearly touched the surface. Then, with what must have been its last reserves of strength, it lunged forward. The bank was steep here, slick with ice, and the palomino's hooves couldn't find purchase. Slid backward, tried again. Failed. Tom knew if he went into the water to help, he'd lose his own footing and they'd both be swept away. He stood at the edge, rope in hand, watching this small creature fight for its life with everything it had left, and felt his throat close with emotion he didn't have time to process. The palomino tried a third time, scrabbling at the bank with its front hooves, and this time managed to hook one leg over solid ground. Tom grabbed the leg without thinking about the danger, about the fact that a panicked horse could shatter bones with a single kick, and pulled. The foal surged up and forward, and then it was on the bank, streaming water and shaking so violently it could barely stand. Tom loosened the rope with numb fingers and stepped back, breathing hard, steam pouring from his mouth with each exhale. 3 foals lay on the creek bank in various states of collapse, and he was standing in a blizzard in nothing but a thermal shirt and jeans. The cold hit him fully now that the adrenaline was fading, hit him so hard his teeth began to chatter. He retrieved his shirt and coat from the bay foal, which still hadn't moved, and pulled them on with fingers that barely functioned. The fabric was soaked through and freezing, but it was better than nothing. He turned in a slow circle, assessing the situation with the part of his brain that still worked. 3 foals, all suffering from severe hypothermia, all too weak to walk. The storm getting worse by the minute. His ranch house 3 miles away through increasingly impassable terrain. The old line shack was closer, maybe 1.5 miles northeast, but it hadn't been used in years and would offer minimal shelter. The barn was 2 miles southeast, fully stocked with hay and blankets and a wood stove that could generate real heat. His truck was parked at the house, useless to him here with the roads already drifted shut. Copper stood waiting, breath steaming, looking at Tom with an expression that seemed to ask what came next. Tom walked to the white foal first, the one that seemed in the best shape relatively speaking. It had stopped shaking quite so violently, which could be a good sign or a very bad one. When hypothermia progressed past a certain point, the shaking stopped because the body no longer had the energy to generate even that response. He crouched beside it, running his hands over its small body, checking for injuries beyond the cold. The foal flinched away from his touch but didn't try to rise. Its legs were scraped raw in places where the ice had torn through the hide, and its breathing came in shallow gasps that worried him. The bay foal lay exactly where Tom had left it, eyes closed, body still. He knelt beside it and put his hand on its chest, feeling for the heartbeat he'd found before. It was still there, but slower now, weaker. The foal's lips had taken on a bluish tint, and when Tom lifted an eyelid, the eye beneath rolled without focusing. This one was in serious trouble. The palomino had managed to get its legs underneath itself and sat like a dog in the snow, head drooping, water still streaming from its mane and tail. It was conscious and alert enough to track Tom's movements, which put it somewhere between the white foal and the bay in terms of immediate danger. Tom stood and looked at Copper, at the rope still attached to his saddle, at the darkening sky and the snow that showed no signs of stopping. He couldn't carry 3 foals. He couldn't make multiple trips in this weather. By the time he got back for the second and third, they'd be dead. The only option was to get them all moving at once, somehow, and get them to shelter before the cold finished what the creek had started. It seemed impossible. Most things worth doing did. He untied the rope from Kappa's saddle and cut it into 3 sections with his pocket knife, fashioning makeshift halters for each foal. The white one accepted it with only mild protest, too exhausted to fight. The palomino let him slip it over its head without reaction. The bay didn't respond at all, which terrified Tom more than he wanted to admit. He tied the 3 ropes together and then to Kappa's saddle horn, creating a line that connected all 3 foals to the horse. It was crude and potentially dangerous, but it was all he had. Getting them on their feet was the next challenge. The white foal struggled upright when Tom urged it, legs splayed and shaking but standing. The palomino took longer, needing Tom's hands under its chest to heave it up, but once vertical it managed to stay that way. The bay wouldn't budge. Tom pulled, pushed, cajoled, and finally simply lifted the small horse bodily to its feet. It stood for perhaps 3 seconds before its legs buckled and it went down again. Tom's heart sank. The bay wasn't going to make it. Not like this. He stood in the whirling snow, feeling the cold work deeper into his bones, feeling the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on him. He could load the bay onto Kappa's back, but the horse was already going to be pulling 2 foals through deep snow. Adding a third might be too much, and if Copper went down, they all died. He could leave the bay here, focus on saving the 2 that might survive, come back later if the storm cleared. But later would be too late, and Tom knew it. The bay would be frozen solid within an hour. Rachel's voice came to him then, clear as if she stood beside him in the storm. A memory from years ago, when they'd found a newborn calf rejected by its mother, too weak to stand, clearly not going to survive the night. Tom had wanted to put it down quickly, humanely, spare it the suffering. Rachel had wrapped the calf in blankets, carried it to the house, and spent 3 days feeding it with a bottle every 2 hours. The calf had lived. Tom had asked her later why she'd fought so hard for something that seemed hopeless, and she'd looked at him with those green eyes that saw through to his core and said simply, "Because giving up is easy, and easy isn't the same as right." Tom bent and scooped the bay foal into his arms. It weighed maybe 80 pounds, all dead weight, and his back protested immediately. He'd injured it years ago, a stupid accident involving a spooked horse and a barn door, and it never quite healed right. The cold made it worse, made everything worse, but he ignored the pain and began walking. Copper followed, and the rope pulled taut, bringing the white and palomino foals stumbling along behind. They moved in a strange procession through the deepening snow, heading southeast toward the barn, toward warmth and shelter and the slim hope of survival. The first 100 yards nearly broke him. The snow came up to his knees in places, deeper in the drifts, and every step forward required deliberate effort. The bay foal was a furnace of cold against his chest, its wet coat soaking through his clothes, stealing what little warmth he had left. Behind him, the white and palomino foals stumbled along, connected by rope to Copper, who picked his way through the drifts with the careful determination of a horse who understood the stakes. The wind drove snow into Tom's face hard enough to sting, and he had to keep his head down, navigating by instinct and the vague shapes of familiar landmarks. His back began to spasm after the first quarter mile, sharp pains shooting down his left leg with each step. He gritted his teeth and kept moving. The bay foal hadn't stirred since he'd picked it up, and he couldn't tell if it was still breathing. He didn't dare stop to check. Stopping meant losing momentum, and losing momentum in snow this deep meant not starting again. The white foal fell twice, and each time Tom had to set down the bay, help the white one up, lift the bay again. His arms trembled with exhaustion, and his legs felt like they belonged to someone else, distant and unreliable. The world narrowed to the next step and the next and the next. Tom stopped thinking about the distance remaining, stopped calculating odds, stopped doing anything but putting one foot in front of the other. The storm erased everything beyond a few feet in any direction, turning the familiar landscape alien and hostile. He couldn't see the barn yet, couldn't see anything but white, but his internal compass told him they were heading the right way. He'd walked this land for nearly 50 years, knew it in his bones the way some people knew cities, and that knowledge guided him now when his eyes couldn't. Time lost meaning. He might have been walking for 20 minutes or 2 hours. His body had gone past pain into a kind of numb determination that felt almost peaceful. The bay foal was impossibly heavy now, or maybe he was impossibly weak. Kappa's breath came in great clouds beside him, the horse's muzzle nearly touching Tom's shoulder as if offering encouragement. The rope connecting the other 2 foals stayed taut, which meant they were still on their feet, still moving. Small victories. He'd take what he could get. The barn materialized out of the snow like a gift from God, its red walls dark against the white chaos, its familiar shape triggering a surge of relief so powerful Tom's knees nearly buckled. He staggered the last 50 yards, past the loading pen, past the equipment shed, to the main doors. They were latched shut against the wind, and Tom had to set the bay foal down in the snow to wrestle them open. His fingers were so cold they barely worked, and the latch seemed to actively resist his efforts, but finally it gave way and the doors swung wide. The interior of the barn was dark and bitterly cold, but it was shelter. No wind reached inside these walls, and the temperature, while still well below freezing, felt tropical compared to the storm outside. Tom carried the bay foal inside, laid it gently on the concrete floor, and went back for the others. Copper came willingly, and the white and palomino foals stumbled after him, too exhausted to be afraid of the enclosed space. Tom shut the doors, plunging them into near-total darkness broken only by thin cracks of gray light between the boards. His hands shook as he fumbled for the lantern he kept hanging just inside the door. Finding matches in his pocket with numb fingers took 3 tries, and the first 2 matches broke before he could strike them. The third caught, and he touched the flame to the lantern's wick. Warm light bloomed outward, pushing back the shadows, revealing the barn's interior. The hayloft above, the empty stalls along both walls, the tack room in the back corner. And in the far wall, the wood stove that might mean the difference between life and death. Tom moved on autopilot now, his body performing tasks his mind was too exhausted to consciously direct. He gathered wood from the pile stacked against the back wall, old split logs that had been drying for years. His hands fumbled with kindling and newspaper, building the fire with methods learned so long ago they'd become instinct. The match flame caught the paper caught the kindling caught the logs. Smoke rose and was pulled up through the stovepipe that exited through the roof. Within minutes, heat began to radiate from the iron surface. He turned his attention to the foals. The white one stood in the middle of the barn, head hanging, shaking. The palomino had collapsed near the door, sides heaving. The bay lay where Tom had put it, utterly still. He went to the tack room and pulled down every blanket he could find, old saddle blankets that smelled of dust and horse sweat and years of use. Rachel's burgundy wool blanket was among them, the one she'd used on Copper, and Tom's throat tightened when he recognized it. He carried the pile to the foals and began the work of drying them off. The white foal accepted his ministrations with dull-eyed exhaustion, too tired to care that a human was touching it. Tom rubbed it down vigorously with the blankets, trying to restore circulation, then wrapped it in dry ones and led it into one of the stalls. He spread hay thick on the floor and left the foal standing there, swaying slightly, steam rising from its body in the lantern light. The palomino was next, and it required more effort to rouse enough to move. Tom got it into the stall beside the white foal, dried it as best he could, and wrapped it in blankets that it immediately tried to shake off. That left the bay. Tom knelt beside the small horse, and his heart sank. The foal was breathing, but barely, its sides moving in shallow, irregular rhythms that spoke of a body shutting down. Its eyes were closed, and when Tom lifted an eyelid, the pupil didn't respond to the lantern light. The foal's temperature had dropped too far, and it was slipping away despite everything Tom had done. He wrapped it in Rachel's burgundy blanket, the warmest one he had, and carried it close to the wood stove, setting it down on a bed of hay within the heat's direct reach. Then, because he didn't know what else to do, he sat down beside it and placed his hand on its small chest. The heartbeat under his palm was faint and irregular, skipping beats in a pattern that couldn't sustain life much longer. Tom had seen animals die before, had put down horses and cattle that were injured beyond saving, had held Rachel's hand as her own heartbeat grew fainter and more irregular in exactly this same terrible way. He recognized the signs. The bay foal was dying. Something cracked open inside him then, some wall he'd built 3 years ago to contain the grief that threatened to swallow him whole. It poured out now in the lantern-lit barn, with his hand on a dying foal's chest and the storm howling outside. He bent forward, pressing his forehead against the burgundy blanket, feeling the small body underneath struggling with its last reserves of strength, and he wept. Not the silent tears he'd shed at Rachel's funeral, standing dry-eyed and numb while people offered condolences he couldn't process. These were the tears he'd held back for 3 years, raw and desperate and breaking out of him in great shuddering sobs that shook his whole body. He cried for Rachel, for the life they'd planned and never got to live, for the children they'd wanted and never had, for all the mornings he'd woken up to an empty house and empty days stretching ahead with no purpose beyond survival. He cried for these foals, for their desperate fight in the frozen creek, for the way they'd looked at him with eyes that begged for help he might not be able to give. He cried for his own exhaustion, for the weight of being alone, for the creeping understanding that he'd been dying himself these past 3 years, just in a slower and less obvious way than hypothermia. Copper came and stood beside him, lowering his head to rest it against Tom's shoulder. The warmth of the horse's breath touched Tom's neck, and the solid presence steadied him enough that the sobs eventually subsided into harsh breathing. He lifted his head and wiped his eyes with the back of one hand, feeling scraped hollow and somehow cleaner for it. The bay foal's heartbeat under his palm continued its irregular pattern. Still dying, still fighting, still here. Tom took a deep breath and made a decision. He'd fought to get them this far. He'd carried them through a blizzard, built a fire, done everything physically possible to save them. But sometimes survival required more than the physical. Sometimes it required someone to simply refuse to let go. He'd let go of too much already. He stretched out on the hay beside the bay foal, wrapping his body around its small frame, adding his warmth to the blanket's warmth and the stove's warmth. He placed both hands on its chest and felt for that fragile heartbeat. The night stretched long and cold despite the fire. Tom lay on the hay with the bay foal pressed against his chest, his body heat the only thing standing between the small horse and death. Every 15 minutes he roused himself enough to add wood to the stove, then returned to his position wrapped around the foal. The irregular heartbeat under his hands became a metronome marking time, and he found himself counting the beats, willing them to continue, to strengthen, to steady into the rhythm that meant life. Somewhere past midnight the shaking started. At first Tom thought it was his own body trembling from exhaustion and cold, but then he realized the movement came from the foal. Violent shudders ran through the small frame, muscles contracting in waves that felt almost seizure-like. Tom held on tighter, frightened that this was the end, that he was feeling the final neurological storm before shutdown. But the trembling continued, and after several minutes he understood what was happening. The foal's core temperature was rising enough that its body could respond again, and shivering was how it generated heat. Tom pressed his face against the burgundy blanket and felt something like hope flicker in his chest. The foal was fighting back. His body hadn't given up. The heartbeat under his palms seemed fractionally stronger, the intervals between beats fractionally more regular. He stayed there, counting beats, feeding the fire, drifting in and out of an exhausted half-sleep where reality and dreams blurred together. In one dream Rachel stood at the barn door with snow in her hair, smiling that smile that had first caught his attention at the county fair 30 years ago. In another the foals were running through summer grass, healthy and whole, their legs flashing in sunlight that felt like a memory of something he'd lost. When dawn broke, pale and hesitant through the cracks in the barn walls, Tom woke fully to find the bay foal's eyes open. They were glazed and unfocused, but they were open, and when Tom moved his hand, the foal tracked the movement. The heartbeat under his palm had strengthened considerably, and the breathing, while still shallow, had taken on a more regular pattern. Tom sat up slowly, every muscle in his body protesting, and looked at the small horse beside him. It was alive. Against all odds and reasonable expectations, it was alive. The white foal stood in its stall, awake and alert, watching Tom with cautious interest. The palomino lay on its side in the hay, breathing deeply in what looked like actual sleep rather than unconsciousness. All three had survived the night. Tom felt light-headed with relief and hunger and exhaustion. He had no idea what time it was, no sense of how long he'd been in the barn. The storm outside had diminished to occasional gusts that rattled the walls, and the temperature inside had risen to merely cold rather than dangerously frigid. He stood on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment and made his way to the water trough in the corner. Ice had formed across the surface overnight, and he had to break through it with his elbow. The cold water he splashed on his face shocked him into fuller wakefulness, and he looked down at himself for the first time since the rescue. His clothes were still damp, stiff with ice in places, and streaked with mud and blood from the foal's injuries. His hands were scraped raw, several fingernails torn, and his knuckles had split open in places where the cold had made the skin brittle. The sound of an engine reached him through the barn walls, growing louder as it approached. Tom moved to the door and cracked it open, squinting against the brightness of snow under morning sun. A truck was grinding up the driveway, four-wheel drive engaged, throwing up plumes of powder as it fought through the drifts. Tom recognized the vehicle before he could make out the driver. Frank Kowalski's county truck, the one he used when weather made the roads impassable to normal vehicles. The truck stopped near the barn and Frank climbed out, a big man in his late 40s with a gray beard and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. He'd been a ranch hand before joining the sheriff's department, and he knew cattle and horses as well as he knew county ordinances. He took one look at Tom standing in the barn doorway, and his expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Tom Bennett, you look like you've been through a war." Frank's voice carried across the snow with the easy authority of someone used to taking charge of situations. "What happened out here?" "I got a call from Ellen Graves saying she saw copper running loose near the creek yesterday evening. Figured I better check on you when the storm cleared enough to drive." Tom felt his exhaustion multiply at the thought of explaining. Ellen Graves lived 3 properties over, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who noticed everything that happened in the valley. If she'd seen copper without a rider, she would have worried, and in a place like Blackridge Valley, worry meant action. He gestured for Frank to come inside, and the deputy approached, his boots crunching in the snow. The barn's interior was warm enough now that steam rose from the water trough, and the smell of hay and horse and wood smoke created an atmosphere that was almost cozy despite the concrete floors and rough walls. Frank stepped inside and stopped short when he saw the foals. The white one had come to the stall door and stood watching them with big dark eyes. The palomino had risen to its feet and stood hip-shot in the corner, ears swiveling to track the stranger's movements. The bay remained where Tom had left it, wrapped in the burgundy blanket, but its head was up now and it looked alert. Frank let out a low whistle. Where did these come from? His trained eye was already assessing them, noting their size and condition, the makeshift halters still around their necks, the scrapes and cuts visible on their legs. "These aren't yours, Tom. What's the story?" Tom leaned against the door frame, suddenly aware of how much energy it took just to stand upright. "Found them in Willow Creek yesterday evening. Ice gave way under them. They would have died if I hadn't gotten them out." His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw from cold and emotion and lack of sleep. Frank moved closer to the stalls, his law enforcement instincts engaging. Foals this young shouldn't be out in winter at all, and certainly not alone. Where are the mares? He glanced at Tom, and something in his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "Don't know." Tom pushed off from the door frame and walked to the wood stove, adding another log even though it didn't really need it. Just the foals in the creek, no other horses around. The storm was getting bad, Didn't have time to search. Got them here and spent the night trying to keep them alive. Frank crouched near the white foal, extending his hand slowly for it to sniff. The foal shied back but didn't panic, which Tom took as a good sign. After a moment, Frank stood and turned to face Tom fully. His expression had shifted from concern to something harder, the look of a man working through implications he didn't like. Tom, these foals are too young to be weaned. They're maybe 3 months old, for at most. No mare would abandon foals this age unless something prevented her from staying with them. Tom knew where this was going. He'd been too focused on survival to think through the larger questions, but now in the cold light of morning they were unavoidable. Someone put them there, he said quietly, or drove them there. Either way, this wasn't an accident. Frank nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. I'll need to make some calls. Check if anyone's reported missing horses, though I doubt we'll find legitimate owners. He walked a circuit around the barn, examining the foals from different angles, and Tom could see him cataloging details the way he would at a crime scene. These are good-looking animals. That Palomino has a nice build, could be worth decent money in a few years. White one too. Someone either stole them or was trying to get rid of them, and neither option is legal. The implications settled over Tom like another kind of cold. He'd saved the foals' lives, but in doing so he'd potentially stepped into the middle of theft or abuse or both. The legal complications were secondary to the moral ones in his mind, but he understood they'd have to be addressed. What happens now? He asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Frank pulled out his phone, checked for signal, and frowned at the screen. Still sketchy out here. I'll head back to town, make those calls, start an investigation. In the meantime, these foals stay with you. They're evidence, and more importantly, they need care. He looked at Tom with an expression that might have been sympathy. You up for that? Taking care of 3 bottle babies is no small thing, Tom. They'll need feeding every few hours, round the clock, for weeks. Months, really, until they're old enough to transition fully to solid food. Tom looked at the 3 foals, at the white one watching him with cautious trust, at the Palomino beginning to doze again in its stall, at the bay still wrapped in Rachel's blanket. He thought about his empty house, his empty days, the 3 years he'd spent going through motions without purpose. He thought about the moment last night when he'd broken down beside a dying foal and felt something crack open inside him that had been frozen solid. I'm up for it, he said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. Frank clapped him on the shoulder, a brief gesture of approval. Good man. I'll be back later with supplies. You're going to need formula, bottles, blankets, probably some medical gear. Dr. Rhodes should take a look at them too. Make sure there's no internal damage from the cold. He headed for the door, then paused. Tom, what you did yesterday, that was something. Most people would have kept riding. Tom didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded. Frank left, and the sound of his truck faded into the distance, leaving Tom alone with the foals and the crackling fire and the enormity of what he'd taken on. He looked at Copper, who stood near the stalls with his usual patient expression, and managed a tired smile. Well, partner, looks like we're in the horse business again. The morning passed in a blur of activity that kept Tom moving despite his exhaustion. He used the last of his energy to haul water from the house in buckets, breaking through the ice that had formed on the outdoor spigot. The foals needed hydration more urgently than food, and he coaxed them to drink small amounts, starting with the white one who seemed most willing to accept his help. The Palomino took longer to convince, but eventually dipped its muzzle into the bucket and drank in small cautious sips. The bay foal refused at first, turning its head away, but Tom persisted with the patience born of understanding that sometimes survival required accepting help even when every instinct said to refuse it. By noon the sun had broken through fully, turning the snow-covered landscape into a blinding field of white that hurt to look at directly. The temperature had risen above 0, and Tom could hear the drip of melting snow from the barn's roof, each drop marking time in the strange new reality he'd stepped into. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, watching the foals and fighting the urge to simply lay down in the hay and sleep for a week, when another vehicle turned into the driveway. This one was a mud-splattered SUV with a trailer hitch on the back, and Tom recognized it before the driver emerged. Dr. Virginia Rhodes had been the valley's large animal vet for 30 years, and she'd seen Tom through countless emergencies with cattle and horses over the decades. She was a tall woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of no-nonsense competence that came from dealing with animals and the people who owned them. She climbed out of the SUV carrying a large medical bag and wearing insulated coveralls that had seen better days. "Frank called me," she said without preamble, her breath steaming in the cold air. "Said you pulled 3 foals out of Willow Creek and they needed looking at." Her sharp eyes took in Tom's appearance, and something flickered across her face that might have been concern. "You need looking at too, from what I can see." Tom stood, his back protesting the movement, and led her into the barn. The foals had grown more comfortable with their surroundings over the past hours, and all 3 were on their feet now, the white and palomino in their stalls and the bay standing on shaky legs near the stove. Dr. Rhodes set down her bag and approached them slowly, making soft sounds that horses responded to instinctively. She examined each foal in turn, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, checking temperatures and pulses and reflexes. The white foal stood quietly for the examination, only flinching slightly when Dr. Rhodes palpated its ribs. The palomino was more resistant, trying to back away, but the vet worked with calm persistence until she'd completed her assessment. The bay foal, still the weakest of the 3, swayed slightly under her touch but didn't try to move away. When she'd finished, Dr. Rhodes straightened and fixed Tom with a look that was part approval, part concern. "They're in remarkably good shape considering what they've been through. You got them warm fast enough to prevent serious frostbite, and I don't see signs of pneumonia yet, though we'll need to watch for that over the next few days. The bay is still in the danger zone, its core temperature isn't quite where it should be, but it's improving." She pulled supplies from her bag as she spoke, bottles and syringes and packets of powder. "I'm leaving you with electrolyte solution and instructions for feeding. They'll need small amounts every 2 hours to start, gradually increasing as their systems stabilize." Tom took the supplies, trying not to think about how little sleep he was going to get over the coming days. Dr. Rhodes seemed to read his thoughts because she smiled slightly, the expression softening her stern features. "You look like you're running on empty, Tom. Is there someone who can help you with this? It's a lot for one person." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken knowledge. Everyone in the valley knew about Rachel, knew that Tom had withdrawn after her death, knew that his ranch had become more prison than home over the past 3 years. Tom shook his head slowly. "I'll manage." He wasn't sure if that was true, but it was the only answer he had. Dr. Rhodes packed up her bag with efficient movements, but her eyes stayed on Tom. "You saved their lives yesterday. Don't forget to save your own while you're at it." She left before he could formulate a response, and Tom stood in the barn doorway watching her SUV navigate the drifted driveway, feeling the weight of her words settle somewhere in his chest. The afternoon brought another visitor, this one unexpected. Tom was in the middle of feeding the white foal, holding a bottle of electrolyte solution while the animal sucked at it with increasing enthusiasm, when he heard the crunch of boots on snow outside. A boy appeared in the barn doorway, small and bundled in a red flannel jacket that looked too big for him, his face nearly hidden beneath a knit cap. He stopped at the threshold, eyes going wide when he saw the foals. Tom recognized him after a moment. Jesse Williams, the youngest son of the family that owned the property bordering his to the south. The boy was maybe 10 years old, small for his age, with the kind of quiet watchfulness that suggested he spent more time observing than talking. Tom had seen him occasionally riding his bicycle on the road, had exchanged waves but never much conversation. Now Jesse stood in the doorway looking like he wasn't sure whether to come in or run away. "It's okay," Tom said, keeping his voice low so as not to startle the foals. "You can come in if you want." He watched the boy's internal debate play out across his face, curiosity warring with shyness, before Jesse took a tentative step inside. The white foal had finished the bottle and Tom set it aside, giving the boy his full attention. "Your folks know you're here?" Jesse nodded, his eyes never leaving the foals. "Mom said I could come see them. She heard about the rescue from Mrs. Graves." His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried clearly in the barn's acoustics. He took another step forward, then another, drawn by the magnetic pull that horses seem to exert on certain people. Are they going to be okay? Tom considered the question, appreciating that the boy wanted a real answer rather than empty reassurance. I think so. They had a rough time yesterday, but they're strong. With care and luck, they should pull through. He gestured toward the white foal. This one's doing the best. The palomino is stubborn, which is good. Stubbornness helps when you're fighting to survive. The bay over there had the worst of it, but it's holding on. Jesse approached the white foal slowly, his movements instinctive and correct in a way that suggested experience around animals. Can I touch it? He asked, and Tom nodded. The boy extended his hand and the foal sniffed at his fingers, then allowed him to stroke its neck. Jesse's face lit with wonder, and Tom felt something shift in his chest at the sight. There was something pure about a child's joy in the presence of animals, something untainted by the complications that adults brought to every interaction. What are their names? Jesse asked, his hand moving in gentle strokes along the white foal's neck. Tom realized he hadn't named them, hadn't thought that far ahead in the chaos of rescue and survival. But looking at them now, at the white foal with its gray dappling, at the dark bay wrapped in burgundy, at the palomino with its flaxen mane, names seemed to form themselves. That one's Frost, he said, indicating the white foal. The bay is Ember because it's still got fire in it despite everything. And that one, he nodded toward the palomino, is Clover. Jesse repeated the names softly, as if testing how they felt. They're good names. His hand continued its gentle stroking, and Frost leaned into the touch slightly, a gesture of acceptance that made Tom's throat tighten. My grandpa had horses, Jesse said after a moment. He taught me how to be around them before he died. Said horses know things about people that people don't know about themselves. The words hit Tom with unexpected force, carrying the weight of wisdom that sometimes came from children who'd learned important lessons early. He looked at Jesse, really looked at him, and saw something familiar in the boy's quiet demeanor. The kind of stillness that came from loss, from learning too young that the world could take away people you loved without warning or mercy. Tom wondered what the boy's story was, what shadows he carried behind those watchful eyes, but he didn't ask. Some things revealed themselves in their own time. Jesse stayed for an hour, helping Tom prepare the next round of bottles, learning how to hold them at the right angle so the foals didn't gulp air along with the electrolyte solution. He moved through the barn with careful consideration, speaking softly to each foal, introducing himself as if they were honored guests rather than abandoned animals he'd just met. When he finally left, pulling his too large jacket tight against the afternoon cold, he paused at the door and looked back at Tom with an expression that seemed older than his years. Can I come back tomorrow? The question held a weight beyond its simple words, a plea for connection that Tom recognized because he'd felt it himself in the darkest months after Rachel died. The need to be useful, to be part of something that mattered, to have a reason to wake up and face another day. Tom nodded, his throat tight. Anytime, Jesse. I could use the help. The boy's smile was brief but genuine, and then he was gone, a small figure in red flannel trudging through the snow toward home. Tom stood in the doorway watching until Jesse disappeared around the bend in the road, then turned back to the foals who were watching him with varying degrees of interest. Copper nickered from his corner, and Tom walked over to run his hand down the horse's neck. We've got ourselves a helper, he said quietly. Maybe several, the way things are going. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the foal's needs. Tom set an alarm for every 2 hours and dragged himself from brief periods of sleep to prepare bottles and tend to 3 increasingly demanding patients. Frost adapted quickly, sucking down the formula with enthusiasm and gaining strength visibly with each feeding. Clover remained cautious but cooperative, accepting food and care while maintaining a careful distance from too much direct contact. Ember proved the most challenging, still weak and reluctant to eat, requiring patience and persistence that tested Tom's reserves of both. Frank returned on the second day with news from his investigation. He arrived in the late afternoon, his county truck loaded with supplies donated by various people around the valley. Mrs. Graves had contributed blankets and a space heater. Mr. Pierce from the feed store had sent hay and grain. A rancher Tom barely knew had provided bottles and formula. The generosity overwhelmed him, this quiet outpouring of support from a community he'd largely withdrawn from over the past 3 years. Frank helped unload everything, stacking it in the tack room with military precision, then stood in the barn watching the foals with the contemplative expression of someone working through complicated thoughts. "I've made calls to every ranch within 100 miles, he said finally. Nobody's reported missing foals. Checked with the BLM about wild horse populations too. But these don't match any of the herds they track in this area." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Tom, I think someone dumped these foals deliberately. Maybe they were stolen and became too much trouble to keep. Maybe they were from an illegal breeding operation. Either way, somebody wanted them gone and didn't care if they died in the process." Tom felt anger kindle in his chest, sharp and clean. The kind of person who would leave foals to freeze deserved consequences he wouldn't allow himself to articulate. "What happens now?" he asked, keeping his voice level with effort. Frank shrugged, a gesture of frustration. "Without evidence of who did it, not much I can do on the criminal side. But on the practical side, these foals need an owner of record. Since you're the one providing care, I can start paperwork to establish legal custody. After a reasonable period, if no legitimate owner comes forward, they'd be yours free and clear." He met Tom's eyes. "Assuming that's something you want." Tom looked at the 3 foals, at Frost nosing through hay in search of the choicest pieces, at Clover dozing in a patch of sunlight that streamed through a gap in the boards, at Ember standing close to the wood stove with Rachel's burgundy blanket still draped across its back. He thought about the empty stalls that had stayed empty for 3 years, the barn that had echoed with absence, the life he'd been moving through like a ghost. "I want it," he said, and felt the truth of it settle into his bones. Jesse became a regular presence, arriving each afternoon after school with his homework tucked in a backpack and determination written across his young face. He worked alongside Tom without complaint, mucking stalls and mixing formula and learning the 1,000 small tasks that went into keeping 3 foals alive and thriving. The boy had a natural way with animals that couldn't be taught, a patience and gentleness that the foals responded to instinctively. Within a week, all 3 would come to him willingly, even Ember, who remained skittish around most movement. Tom found himself looking forward to Jesse's visits, to the quiet companionship of working alongside someone who didn't require constant conversation, but whose presence filled the barn with something that felt like hope. They talked sometimes, brief exchanges about school or weather or the foals' progress, but more often they worked in comfortable silence broken only by the sounds of horses and the crackle of the wood stove. Jesse had an intuitive understanding of when to speak and when to simply be present, a quality Tom appreciated more than he could express. One afternoon while they were feeding Ember, who still required the most coaxing to eat, Jesse spoke suddenly into the quiet. "My grandpa died 2 years ago. Heart attack while he was fixing fence. Mom found him in the south pasture." The words came out flat, matter of fact, but Tom heard the grief underneath them. He paused in his work, giving the boy the space to continue if he chose. Jesse kept his eyes on Ember, his hand stroking the foal's neck with gentle repetition. "I was with him that morning. We were checking the cattle together and he was teaching me things. Then he said he needed to fix some fence and I should head to school. If I'd stayed, maybe I could have gotten help faster. Maybe he'd still be here." The guilt in the boy's voice was painfully familiar. Tom had carried similar weight after Rachel died. All the what-ifs and if-onlys that accumulated like stones in a pocket, pulling you down every time you tried to move forward. He set down the bottle he'd been holding and looked at Jesse directly. "Your grandpa sounds like he was a good teacher." The boy nodded, still not meeting his eyes. Tom continued carefully, picking his words like he was navigating a narrow trail in bad weather. "Good teachers want their students to live full lives, not to carry guilt for things they couldn't control." He paused, thinking of Rachel and the conversations they'd had near the end, when she'd made him promise not to disappear into grief. "I think your grandpa would want you to remember what he taught you, not to blame yourself for what happened." Jesse finally looked up, his eyes bright with tears he was trying hard not to shed. "It's hard," he said simply, and Tom nodded because there was no other honest response. "Yeah, it is," But it gets different. Not easier exactly, but different. He gestured toward the foals. These three are alive because you've been here helping. That matters. Your grandpa would be proud of that. The boy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and turned his attention back to Ember, who had finally started sucking at the bottle with something approaching enthusiasm. Tom watched them for a moment, this young boy and this recovering foal, both working through their own versions of survival, and felt a shift in the atmosphere of the barn. It no longer felt like a place of absence but rather a place of presence, of life being actively tended and nurtured back to strength. The weeks flowed into each other, marked by the incremental progress of healing. Ember's strength returned gradually, each day bringing small victories like walking across the barn without stumbling, or finishing a full bottle without having to be coaxed. Clover's wariness began to thaw, allowing more contact, even seeking out Tom's presence in the quiet hours of early morning when he came to check on them before dawn. Frost grew confident and bold, nickering whenever Tom or Jessie entered the barn, coming to the stall door with ears forward and eyes bright with the kind of trust that had to be earned through consistent care. Dr. Rhodes visited weekly, monitoring their progress with professional approval tempered by cautionary reminders about the long road still ahead. "They're doing well," she told Tom during one visit in early February, "but don't let that fool you into thinking they're out of danger. Foals this young are fragile and setbacks can happen fast. Watch for any signs of respiratory distress, changes in appetite, lethargy." Her warnings were necessary, but Tom barely needed them. He'd become so attuned to the foals' rhythms that he could sense shifts in their condition before obvious symptoms appeared. The community's involvement expanded in ways both expected and surprising. Ellen Graves began stopping by with containers of soup and fresh bread, insisting Tom needed to eat properly if he was going to maintain the demanding schedule of round-the-clock care. Mr. Pierce from the feed store called periodically to check if supplies were running low, always managing to find reasons why he had extra inventory he needed to move anyway. Lucas Grant, a young ranch hand who worked various properties around the valley, appeared one Saturday morning with tools and lumber to repair the stalls that had deteriorated over years of disuse. Tom found himself part of a network he hadn't realized still existed for him, a web of quiet support that operated without fanfare or expectation of reciprocation. It unsettled him at first, this return to connection after years of isolation, but gradually he accepted it the way the foals had learned to accept care, with cautious gratitude and the understanding that sometimes refusing help was just another form of pride. February brought a thaw, the kind of false spring that happens sometimes in Montana, where temperatures rose into the 40s and snow began to melt in earnest before winter reasserted itself with renewed vigor. On one of these warmer days, Tom opened the barn doors wide to let fresh air circulate, and the foals caught their first real glimpse of the world beyond the walls that had sheltered them. Frost approached the opening with characteristic boldness, stretching its neck to sniff the air beyond the threshold. Clover followed more cautiously, while Ember hung back near the stove, not yet ready to venture toward the unknown. Jessie arrived that afternoon to find Tom standing in the doorway watching the foals explore their expanded environment. The boy joined him, and together they observed Frost take its first tentative steps into the yard, hooves sinking slightly in the slush, eyes wide with wonder at the vast expanse of white that stretched to the horizon. "Look at that," Jessie said softly, his voice carrying pride and something deeper. "They're getting strong." Tom nodded, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest that he recognized after a moment as happiness. Pure and uncomplicated, untainted by the grief that had colored every emotion for 3 years. "They are," he agreed, and then because the moment seemed to call for more truth than he usually allowed himself, he added, "You helped with that. I couldn't have done this alone." Jessie glanced at him, surprised by the acknowledgement, then smiled with the kind of pleasure that came from being seen and valued. His grandfather's too large red flannel jacket hung loose on his shoulders, and Tom made a mental note to ask Ellen Graves if she knew someone who could alter it to fit better. The boy had earned clothing that fit properly, had earned a place in this barn and in the strange new life Tom was building from the wreckage of the old one. March arrived with renewed cold, winter's last assertion of dominance before spring could truly claim the land. The foals had grown noticeably, their legs lengthening, their bodies filling out with the kind of healthy development that came from consistent care and proper nutrition. They transitioned partially to solid food, though they still required bottle feeding several times a day. Tom had moved them to a larger enclosure he'd constructed in the barn, giving them room to move and play, and their increasing activity level spoke to strength that would have seemed impossible 2 months ago. Frank returned on a cold March morning with official paperwork and news. "The legal waiting period has passed," he announced, setting a folder on Tom's kitchen table. "Nobody's come forward to claim them, and given the circumstances of how you found them, the county's processed your application for custody. As of today, those foals are legally yours." He pushed the papers across the table, and Tom looked down at the forms that made official what had already become true in every way that mattered. Tom Bennett, horse owner. The identity felt strange and familiar at once, like putting on an old coat and finding it still fit despite the years. He signed where Frank indicated, his signature looking shaky on the official forms, then sat back and let the reality settle over him. 3 foals that by all rights should have died in Willow Creek now belonged to him, their survival and future his responsibility and, unexpectedly, his purpose. Frank gathered the signed papers with efficient movements, then paused before leaving. "You've done good work here, Tom. Rachel would be proud." The mention of her name, so rarely spoken aloud in Tom's presence since her death, sent a jolt through his system. But instead of the usual surge of grief, he felt something softer. A bittersweet acknowledgement that she would indeed have approved, would have been right there beside him through all of this, would have loved Jesse's gentle presence and the foal's growing strength. "Thank you," Tom managed, his voice rough. Frank nodded, understanding passing between them without need for additional words, then left Tom alone with the papers that made official what his heart had already claimed. Spring arrived incrementally, not as a single transformative moment but as a series of small changes that accumulated into something undeniable. The snow receded, revealing brown grass that would green with time. The days lengthened, light arriving earlier and staying later. The aspens began to bud, their branches taking on a subtle haze of emerging leaves. And in the barn, 3 foals grew stronger and more confident, their transformation mirroring the seasons. Tom stood at the pasture fence one morning in early April, watching frost and clover race across newly revealed grass, their legs flashing in sunlight that held genuine warmth for the first time in months. Ember followed at a slower pace, still the most cautious of the 3, but moving with steady grace that bore no resemblance to the half-frozen creature Tom had pulled from Willow Creek. Copper grazed nearby, his presence a calming influence on the younger horses, teaching them through example how to exist in this expanded world. Jesse had helped Tom repair the pasture fence over the past weeks, the boy learning practical skills while they worked side by side in companionable silence. The fence now stood straight and strong, ready to contain horses who were rapidly outgrowing the barn that had been their entire universe. Tom felt satisfaction in the physical work, in the tangible evidence of things made right through effort and attention. The ranch that had fallen into disrepair during his years of grief was coming back to life, not as it had been but as something new. Dr. Rhodes visited one final time to do a comprehensive health assessment before releasing them from her regular care schedule. She examined each foal thoroughly, taking her time, then straightened with an expression of professional satisfaction. They're healthy, strong, developing right on schedule. Whatever trauma they experienced hasn't left lasting physical damage. She packed up her medical bag, then fixed Tom with that penetrating look he'd come to recognize as her way of seeing past surfaces to underlying truths. "You saved them, Tom. But I think maybe they saved you too." Tom didn't know how to respond to that observation, so he simply nodded. Dr. Rhodes patted his shoulder once, a brief gesture of approval, then headed for her SUV, calling back as she walked, "Keep doing what you're doing. Those are going to be fine horses." Tom watched her vehicle disappear down the drive, then turned back to the pasture where 3 foals played in spring sunshine, living proof that sometimes survival depended on someone refusing to give up even when giving up seemed like the only reasonable option. The evening light stretched long across the valley, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Tom sat on the porch steps, coffee cooling in his hands, watching the foals settle for the night. Jesse had gone home an hour ago, promising to return tomorrow after school to help with the new training regimen they'd planned. The boy had become indispensable, his presence woven into the fabric of Tom's days so thoroughly that the barn felt emptier during the hours when school kept him away. Frost approached the fence line, ears forward, and called to Tom with a soft nicker that carried clearly in the evening stillness. Tom set down his coffee and walked to the fence, and the foal came to him without hesitation, pressing its muzzle into his hand. Clover and Ember followed, drawn by the promise of attention, and Tom found himself surrounded by 3 horses who had learned to trust despite every reason they'd been given not to. He stroked each one in turn, feeling the warmth of their bodies, the strength that had replaced fragility, the life that pulsed through them in steady heartbeats under his hands. Copper wandered over to join them, the elder statesman checking on his charges, and Tom rested his other hand on the red roan's neck. The weight of the past 3 years hadn't vanished. The grief for Rachel remained a permanent part of his landscape, but it had shifted somehow. No longer the crushing burden that made each day a battle just to survive, but rather a tender place he carried with him, a reminder of love that had been real and mattered still. The foals had given him a reason to move forward, and in moving forward he discovered that life could surprise you with new purposes even when you thought all purposes had been exhausted. The stars emerged one by one, scattered across the darkening sky like questions waiting to be answered. Tom stood at the fence with his hand on Frost's warm neck and Kappa's steady presence beside him, watching the constellations wool overhead in their ancient patterns. Somewhere out there, someone had left 3 foals to die in a frozen creek. But here, on this ranch in Blackridge Valley, those same foals stood strong and healthy, living testimonies to the possibility of redemption and second chances. Tom thought about Jesse carrying his grandfather's teachings forward through gentle hands on rescued animals. He thought about Frank's quiet investigation and Dr. Rhodes's skilled care and the community's steady support. He thought about all the people who had reached out to help when it would have been easier to look away, and he understood that survival was rarely a solo endeavor. "We saved each other," he said quietly to the horses, and though they couldn't understand his words, they leaned into his touch as if they grasped the sentiment. The night air carried the scent of warming earth and new growth, and Tom breathed it in deeply, filling his lungs with the promise of seasons turning. Inside the house, his empty bed waited, and tomorrow would bring another day of the hard work that foals required. But tonight, standing under stars with horses who had chosen to stay when they could have run, Tom felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He felt whole. Frost nickered softly, and Tom smiled, the expression feeling unfamiliar on his face but right somehow. "Yeah," he said to the foal. "We made it through. All of us." He stayed there until full darkness fell, listening to the quiet sounds of horses settling for sleep, feeling the cold air on his face and the warmth of connection in his chest. The barn doors stood open behind him, light spilling out into the yard, and Tom knew he'd leave them that way. No more closing things off, no more shutting out the world. The doors stayed open now, and whatever came through them, he'd face it with the knowledge that even the coldest winter eventually gave way to spring. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that made the winter storms feel like distant memories, the kind of warmth that soaked into bones and loosened muscles that had been clenched against cold for so long they'd forgotten how to relax. The valley transformed under the sun's attention, brown grass giving way to green, wildflowers erupting across the hillsides in riots of color, and the creek that had nearly claimed 3 lives now bubbled cheerfully over rocks worn smooth by centuries of current. Tom stood in the pasture with sweat dampening his shirt, watching Frost lead Clover and Ember through a game that seemed to involve racing to invisible finish lines only they could perceive. The 3 foals had grown remarkably over the past months, their legs lengthening into the promise of adult height, their bodies filling out with muscle that spoke of good nutrition and plenty of exercise. They moved with the kind of joy that came from never having to doubt where their next meal would come from or whether they'd wake up cold and afraid. Frost had become the undisputed leader of the small herd, bold and curious, always the first to investigate new things Tom introduced to their environment. The white coat with gray dappling had deepened in color as the foal matured, creating patterns that caught the light in ways that made Tom think of storm clouds breaking apart to reveal sky. Clover had settled into the role of mediator, neither as bold as Frost nor as cautious as Ember, moving between the two extremes with an easy grace that suggested wisdom beyond its months. The Palomino's coat had turned truly golden under the summer sun, flaxen mane and tail flowing like silk when it ran. Ember remained the most reserved of the three, but the caution no longer came from fear. Instead, it seemed to be a considered watchfulness, an awareness of surroundings that Tom recognized as intelligence rather than trauma. The bay's coat had darkened to a deep mahogany that gleamed with health, and though Ember still preferred to stay close to familiar territory, it no longer flinched at sudden movements or unexpected sounds. The transformation was complete, the half-frozen creature from Willow Creek replaced entirely by a healthy young horse with its whole life stretching ahead. Jesse had grown too over these months, not physically, though Tom suspected the boy had gained an inch or two, but in confidence and capability. The shy child who'd first appeared in the barn doorway now moved through the daily routines with practiced efficiency, his touch sure and his instincts sharp. He arrived every day after school, and most weekends found him at the ranch before Tom had finished his morning coffee, eager to begin whatever work needed doing. The red flannel jacket that had belonged to his grandfather now fit properly, altered by Ellen Graves, who'd insisted it was no trouble at all and who'd appeared 3 days later with the jacket perfectly tailored to Jesse's frame. They worked together in the easy silence of people who'd learned each other's rhythms, communicating as much through gesture and shared understanding as through words. Tom taught Jesse everything he knew about horses, lessons learned over a lifetime of ranching, and the boy absorbed it all with the kind of focused attention that made teaching a pleasure rather than a chore. In return, Jesse brought something to the ranch that Tom hadn't realized he'd been missing. Not just help with the physical labor, though that was valuable, but a sense of continuity, of knowledge being passed forward rather than dying with the generation that held it. One afternoon in late June, while they were cleaning out the water troughs, Jesse spoke into the comfortable quiet. "My mom's been asking if it would be okay for her to meet you properly. She wants to thank you for letting me spend so much time here." The boy kept his eyes on his work, but Tom heard the uncertainty underneath the casual words. Jesse had been coming to the ranch for months now, but his mother had remained a distant figure, someone Tom had waved to across property lines but never actually met. Tom finished scrubbing algae from the trough sides before responding. "She's welcome anytime, though I should be thanking her for raising a son who works as hard as you do." He glanced at Jesse and saw the boy's shoulders relax slightly, tension Tom hadn't noticed releasing at the acceptance. "She worries," Jesse said quietly. "After Grandpa died, she started worrying about everything. Me being here so much, she's scared something might happen, that I might get hurt or that I'm in the way." His voice carried the weight of adult concerns he was too young to fully bear but old enough to sense. Tom understood suddenly that Jesse's presence at the ranch wasn't just about the boy's need for purpose, but also about a mother trying to balance letting her son heal against keeping him safe from further loss. "You're not in the way," Tom said firmly. "You're the main reason these three are doing as well as they are. And you can tell your mother I'll make sure nothing happens to you on my watch." He meant it with an intensity that surprised him, this protective feeling toward a boy who wasn't his son but had somehow become his responsibility anyway. Life had a way of creating families that didn't follow traditional bloodlines, connections forged through shared purpose rather than shared genetics. Jesse looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them that needed no words. Understanding, acceptance, the acknowledgement that they'd become important to each other in ways neither had expected. "Okay," the boy said softly. "I'll tell her." They returned to their work, but the atmosphere had shifted slightly. Another layer of foundation laid in a relationship that was becoming one of the most significant in both their lives. 2 days later, a sedan Tom didn't recognize pulled into the driveway just as he and Jesse were finishing the evening feeding. A woman climbed out, early 40s, with Jesse's same watchful eyes and brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a work shirt that suggested she was no stranger to physical labor, and she moved with the kind of careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to consider every action before taking it. Jesse ran to meet her, and Tom hung back, giving them a moment together while he pretended to check the fence line. When they approached, the woman extended her hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Amanda Williams." I've been meaning to come by and introduce myself properly. Thank you for being so patient with Jesse spending all his time here." Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct, but Tom could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the way her free hand rested protectively on Jesse's shoulder. Tom returned the handshake and gestured toward the pasture where the 3 foals grazed in the evening light. "He's been essential. Couldn't have managed without him." It was true in ways that went beyond the practical help, but he kept his tone light, sensing that this woman needed reassurance more than effusive praise. "Would you like to meet them? The foals, I mean." Amanda's expression softened slightly, some of the wariness fading. "Jesse talks about them constantly. I'd like that." They walked to the fence together, Jesse between them, chattering about each foal's personality and progress. Frost came to investigate immediately, always interested in new people, and Amanda reached out tentatively to stroke the white neck. Her smile became more genuine as the foal leaned into her touch. "Jesse says you pulled them out of Willow Creek in January," she said, her eyes on Frost but her words clearly directed at Tom. "That you saved their lives when most people would have kept riding." There was a question underneath the statement, one Tom couldn't quite parse but sensed was important. "I did what needed doing," he said simply, because it was true and because he'd never been good at accepting credit for actions that felt like the only possible choice. They were dying. Couldn't leave them there. Amanda nodded slowly, her hands still moving in gentle strokes along Frost's neck. "My father-in-law used to say that how a person treats animals tells you everything you need to know about their character." She glanced at Tom then, and her expression had shifted to something that might have been approval. "Jesse's told me how you've taught him, how patient you've been. I want you to know how much that means. Since my father-in-law passed, Jesse hasn't had that male influence, someone to show him how to be in the world." Her voice caught slightly on the words, and Tom saw the grief that still lived close to her surface, not unlike his own. "Your father-in-law sounds like he was a good man," Tom said quietly. "Jesse's mentioned him. Said he taught him about horses." Amanda's eyes brightened with tears. She blinked away quickly. "He was the best. Raised my husband. Taught both of us everything we know about ranching. When he died so suddenly, it felt like the center fell out of our world." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "Jesse took it especially hard. They were very close. Having this," she gestured toward the barn, "the foals, the ranch spread out around them. It's given him something to focus on besides the loss. I can't tell you what that's meant to us." Tom felt his throat tighten with emotion he didn't quite know how to process. "I lost my wife 3 years ago," he found himself saying, the words emerging without conscious decision. "Cancer. These months with the foals, with Jesse's help, it's given me something to focus on too. Sometimes I think they saved me as much as I saved them." Amanda met his eyes, and in that moment they understood each other perfectly. Two people carved hollow by grief, finding their way back to wholeness through the simple act of caring for creatures that needed them. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "I think Jesse and I would like to keep coming around, if that's all right with you. Not just him, but maybe I could help too sometimes. I grew up on a ranch, know my way around horses." Tom felt something ease in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. "That would be good," he said. "Really good." Jesse's face lit with pleasure so pure it made Tom's heart ache, and Amanda's shoulders finally dropped from the defensive posture she'd maintained since arriving. They stood together at the fence as the sun sank toward the horizon. 3 people and 3 foals bound together by circumstances none of them could have predicted, but all of them had chosen to embrace. The summer deepened, heat settling over the valley in waves that made the mornings precious for their relative coolness and the evenings welcome for their breeze. Tom and Jesse, joined now sometimes by Amanda, worked with the foals on basic training, teaching them to accept halters willingly, to lead without pulling, to stand for hoof care and grooming. Frost took to the lessons with enthusiasm, always eager to learn new things. Clover proved steady and reliable, never brilliant but never difficult. Ember required more patience, approaching each new skill with caution, but once something was learned, it was learned thoroughly. Dr. Rhodes stopped by in July for what she called a wellness check, but what Tom suspected was really an excuse to see how the foals had developed. She examined each one with her usual thorough efficiency, then straightened with an expression of genuine satisfaction. "These are fine young horses, Tom. You've done excellent work. They're well socialized, healthy, and developing good temperaments. In another year, they'll be ready for more serious training if you decide to pursue that." Tom watched Frost nibbling at Jesse's shirt pocket in search of treats, saw Clover dozing with one hip cocked in the sun, noticed Ember actually approaching Amanda for attention rather than waiting to be approached. "What do you think they'd be good for?" he asked, curious about the professional opinion. "I've been around horses all my life, but I've never raised them from this young." Dr. Rhodes considered the question seriously, her experienced eye assessing each foal in turn. "Frost has the build and temperament for ranch work, could probably do anything you asked once properly trained. That one's bold enough for competition if you were interested, though I suspect you're not." She smiled slightly, knowing Tom well enough to understand that show rings held no appeal. Clover would make an excellent trail horse, steady and sensible. Good for someone who wants a reliable mount without drama. And Ember, she paused, watching the bay foal with thoughtful attention. That one has something special. Intelligence, sensitivity, the kind of horse that bonds deeply with one person. Could be exceptional in the right hands. Tom felt a stirring of something that might have been pride. He'd saved their lives, but genetics had given them their potential. The combination of survival and natural ability had created 3 horses that could go on to meaningful lives doing work that mattered. It felt like a kind of redemption, turning tragedy into purpose, ensuring that the cruelty of their abandonment wouldn't define their entire existence. August brought a heat wave that drove everyone to seek shade during the middle hours of the day. Tom found himself spending afternoons on the porch with Jesse, both of them too overheated to work, talking about everything and nothing while the foals dozed in the pasture. The boy had opened up over the months, sharing stories about his grandfather, about his father who worked construction in Billings and came home only on weekends, about his mother's determination to keep the small ranch running despite the challenges. In return, Tom found himself talking about Rachel, sharing memories he'd kept locked away for 3 years because speaking them aloud had hurt too much. But something had shifted, and now the stories brought more comfort than pain. He told Jesse about how Rachel had named Copper, about her laughter that used to fill the ranch house, about the way she'd insisted on hand-feeding orphaned calves even when it meant waking up every 2 hours for weeks. Jesse listened with the kind of attention that made sharing feel less like unburdening and more like honoring, keeping alive the memory of someone who deserved to be remembered. "You must miss her a lot," Jesse said one afternoon, his voice quiet in the heat-heavy air. Tom considered the statement, weighing the truth of it against the complexity of grief he'd come to understand. "I do," he admitted, "but it's different now than it was. For a long time, missing her meant I couldn't see anything else, couldn't feel anything else, like I was frozen in the moment she died and couldn't move forward." He paused, searching for words to explain something he barely understood himself. The foals thawed that somehow, pulling them out of the creek, fighting to keep them alive, having purpose again. It didn't make me miss her less, but it made the missing part of a larger life instead of the only thing in it. Jesse nodded slowly, processing this. Grandpa used to say that grief is just love with nowhere to go. That made Tom's throat close with emotion because it was exactly right, exactly what he'd been feeling without being able to articulate. The boy continued, his gaze distant. "Mom says time heals, but I don't think that's quite right. Time just teaches you how to carry it differently." The wisdom in those words, coming from a 10-year-old who'd learned about loss too early, struck Tom with force. "You're right," he said quietly. "That's exactly what it does." They sat in silence after that, but it was the kind of silence that held understanding rather than emptiness. 2 people who'd walked through grief and come out the other side changed but not destroyed. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of fall color in the aspens. The foals were 6 months old now, gangly adolescents with legs that seemed too long for their bodies and personalities that had solidified into their permanent forms. Frost remained the bold explorer, always first to investigate anything new. Clover had become the peacekeeper, stepping between Frost and Ember when play got too rough. Ember watched everything with those intelligent eyes, learning from observation as much as from direct experience. Tom had been approached by several people over the summer, word having spread about the rescued foals and their remarkable recovery. A rancher from 3 valleys over had offered to buy Frost, praising the foals' conformation and spirit. A woman who ran a therapeutic riding program had expressed interest in Clover, saying the steady temperament would be perfect for working with children. Even Ember had attracted attention, a horse trainer passing through the area commenting that the bay had the kind of sensitivity that made for exceptional performance horses in the right discipline. Tom had turned down all offers without hesitation, and it wasn't until Jesse asked him why that he fully understood his own reasoning. "They're not for sale," he'd said simply. "They stayed when they could have run. That means something." Jesse had nodded as if this made perfect sense, and perhaps it did. The foals had chosen this place, had chosen Tom, and he owed them more than treating them as commodities to be sold when they became valuable. But deeper than that was the understanding that these 3 horses had given him back his life. Not the life he'd had before Rachel died. That was gone and couldn't be recreated. But a new life, one built on different foundations. One that included Jesse and Amanda and a community he'd rediscovered. One that had purpose and meaning and the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from work done well. Selling the foals would feel like betraying that gift, like saying their value lay in money rather than in the immeasurable ways they'd healed something broken inside him. Fall deepened, temperatures dropping at night though the days remained mild. Tom and Jesse worked on preparing the barn for winter, restocking supplies, checking the structural integrity of walls and roof, making sure the wood stove was in good working order. The memory of last winter's storm lived fresh in both their minds. The way it could sweep down without warning and trap everything in white for days. This year they'd be ready, the barn stocked and secure, the horses fat and healthy with thick coats already beginning to grow in against the coming cold. Amanda had become a regular presence as well, showing up on weekends to help with the heavier work, bringing casseroles and pies that ensured Tom ate properly. She and Tom had developed an easy friendship built on shared understanding and complementary skills. She was better with paperwork and organization, helping him set up proper records for the horses and manage the mundane administrative tasks he'd let slide for years. He was better with repairs and physical labor, and he'd begun helping at her place on the weekends when Jesse didn't need him, fixing things that had broken after her father-in-law died and she'd been managing alone. The valley buzzed with speculation about the nature of their relationship, but Tom ignored it with the same patience he'd learned from working with horses. People would think what they wanted to think. The truth was simpler and more complicated than romance. They were 2 people helping each other survive and occasionally thrive, finding in each other's company a respite from loneliness without the pressure of expectations. It was enough, more than enough actually, and if it ever became something different they'd deal with that when and if it happened. October brought the first snow, just a dusting that melted by noon but served as a reminder that winter was circling closer. The foals were fascinated by it, Frost tasting snowflakes and Clover pawing at the white stuff with obvious curiosity. Even Ember seemed intrigued, nostrils flaring at the cold new scent. Tom watched them from the porch, coffee steaming in his hands, and felt a completeness he'd thought lost forever. Jesse appeared at his elbow, seemingly from nowhere the way the boy had learned to move through the ranch with near-silent efficiency. "Think they remember?" he asked, and Tom didn't have to ask what he meant. The question hung between them, whether the foals carried any memory of that January night in Willow Creek, of ice and cold and near death. "I don't know," Tom answered honestly. "Horses remember trauma, but they live more in the present than humans do. Maybe they remember, maybe they don't. Either way, they're here now, safe. That's what matters." Jesse nodded, satisfied with this answer, and they stood together watching snow fall on horses who'd once nearly died in it and now played in it without fear. The weeks rolled toward winter with increasing speed, each day bringing new preparations and small adjustments to routine. Tom found himself measuring time differently now, not in the empty progression of days he'd endured for 3 years after Rachel's death, but in meaningful increments marked by the foals' growth and Jesse's development and the slow knitting together of a community he'd thought he'd lost. Life had returned to the ranch, not the same life as before but a life nonetheless, built on foundations of survival and choice and the stubborn insistence that giving up was never the answer. December arrived with serious cold, temperatures plunging below zero, wind chill making it dangerous to spend extended time outside. But the barn was warm, the wood stove throwing heat that kept even the coldest nights bearable, and the foals thrived in the controlled environment Tom and Jessie had created. They'd grown remarkably, no longer foals really but yearlings, their bodies filling out with muscle, their personalities fully formed. Frost stood nearly 14 hands now and showed signs of growing taller still. Clover had reached a solid 13.2, compact and sturdy. Ember, always the smallest, had topped out around 13 hands but made up for size with presence, moving with a grace that caught the eye. On a night one year almost to the day after Tom had pulled them from Willow Creek, he stood in the barn with Jessie and Amanda, the three of them watching the yearlings settle for sleep. Copper dozed in his corner, the elder statesman keeping watch over his charges. The wood stove crackled, throwing dancing shadows across the walls, and the smell of hay and horse filled the air with a comfort that felt like home. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Amanda said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "When Jessie first told me about what you'd done, I couldn't imagine how 3 foals that close to death could possibly survive. But look at them now." Tom looked, taking in the scene with eyes that saw not just the present but the journey that had led here. 3 healthy horses, a boy who'd found purpose through grief, a woman who'd allowed herself to accept help, and himself, a man who'd been going through motions of living and had somehow found his way back to actual life. "They saved me as much as I saved them," he said, repeating words that had become a kind of truth he returned to when the world felt uncertain. Jessie moved to stand beside him, shoulder nearly reaching Tom's chest now, the boy having shot up over the past months. "Grandpa would have liked knowing about this," he said quietly. "About the foals, about everything. He always said the best things in life come from the hardest moments, if you're brave enough to stay in them instead of running away." Tom felt his eyes burn with tears he didn't try to hide. "Your grandpa was a wise man." He put his arm around Jessie's shoulders, a gesture that had become natural over months of working together, and the boy leaned into it with the trust of someone who knew he was valued. Amanda moved to Jessie's other side, and they stood like that, 3 people bound together by circumstances none of them would have chosen but all of them had grown through. The wind howled outside, winter asserting itself with the same ferocity it had shown the previous year. But inside the barn, warmth and life and purpose created a sanctuary against the cold. Frost lifted its head to look at them, eyes reflecting the lantern light, then settled back into sleep. Clover shifted weight, hip cocking into the comfortable stance of a horse at ease. Ember, always aware, watched them for a long moment before closing its eyes. Tom thought about the note Frank had brought him months ago, the official papers that made the yearlings legally his. But the real ownership had happened long before paperwork, had been forged in those first desperate hours of rescue and the countless hours of care that followed. These horses were his and he was theirs, bound together by survival and choice and the mysterious alchemy that transformed obligation into love. "We should head inside," Amanda said eventually, though no one moved immediately. Her house waited across the dark fields. Jessie's homework sat undone, and Tom's empty rooms echoed with their usual absence. But for this moment, they stayed together in the barn's warmth, reluctant to break the spell of completeness that settled over them like the snow falling outside. When they finally did leave, Tom walked them to Amanda's sedan, making sure they were safely inside before heading back to the barn for one final check. The yearlings were asleep, Copper keeping his vigil, everything secure against the winter night. Tom stood in the doorway looking back at them, these creatures who'd entered his life when both they and he were dying, and felt gratitude so profound it bordered on prayer. He closed the barn doors and walked through the snow toward the house, no longer the empty structure he'd been rattling around in for 3 years but gradually becoming a home again. Lights glowed in the windows, left on out of habit but also as beacons saying someone lived here, someone who had reasons to return. He thought about Rachel and knew she'd understand what had happened, would approve of Jessie and Amanda, would love the 3 yearlings who'd somehow saved her husband when saving him seemed impossible. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns as old as time, indifferent to human struggles but beautiful nonetheless. Tom paused before going inside, breathing the cold air deep into his lungs, feeling the ache in his back from a day's hard work, hearing the distant sound of horses settling for sleep. Life stretched ahead of him now, not empty and purposeless but filled with responsibilities and connections and the thousand small tasks that added up to meaning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the endless work of caring for horses through winter, the ongoing process of training yearlings who still had much to learn, the delicate balance of building relationships without demanding more than others could give. But tonight, standing under stars with a barn full of life behind him and the memory of community around him, Tom felt something he'd thought lost forever. He felt ready for whatever came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.